Have you ever stopped to think about why so many people feel distant from God? Interestingly, many of them attend churches, pray, and yet still feel a spiritual emptiness. The truth is that our connection with the sacred is disappearing. We live in an era where sacred objects, places, and rituals, which once played a vital role in our faith, are being treated with indifference. And here's the most surprising part. Without realizing it, we are drifting further away from God. But what happens if we start to reclaim this reverence for sacred things? The transformation could be quicker than we imagine. When we understand the importance of sacred objects, rituals, and even moments of silence, we open the door to a deep connection with God. Are you ready to discover what you may have overlooked for so long? Then keep reading and see how the sacred can change everything. From the beginning of time, God designated certain things as sacred. This sanctity is not merely symbolic but deeply spiritual. Sacred things, like the tabernacle and the Holy of Holies, were not just physical structures but represented the divine presence. Through these tangible objects, the people of that time could feel a direct connection with God. However, the true sanctity lies in the fact that these objects were set apart for divine purposes, highlighting the idea that certain things are not common but carriers of a spiritual dimension. Sacredness, then, is not limited to objects of the past, like the tabernacle. It manifests in many aspects of modern life. Think of places and moments that still carry a deep sense of reverence today. Who hasn't been moved when entering a cathedral or witnessing a solemn moment? These moments capture a fraction of what it means to be in touch with the sacred. And it's interesting how, by honoring these spaces and moments, we connect with the broader idea of worship in spirit and truth, something that God asks of us. But in the rush of daily life, can we really separate the common from the sacred? It's easy to forget that God's sanctity is still present around us. Sometimes, we're so immersed in daily worries and distractions that we lose sight of the sacred in small things. Whether it's in the simple act of being grateful for another day of life or in respecting the commandments of God, sacredness is found in how we live and revere what God has set apart as holy. And as we reflect on this, we begin to prepare ourselves to understand more deeply what the holiness of the Scriptures means. The Holy Scriptures, known as the meaning of the Holy Scriptures, hold an unparalleled importance in the Christian faith. The Bible is not just a book, but a sacred channel through which God revealed himself to humanity. It is special not only because of its content but because it was inspired by God himself. Every word, every verse carries spiritual weight, and understanding this dimension goes beyond casual reading. When we reflect on biblical texts, we realize that it is not just any account but a living guide to connect us to the sacred. For this reason, God forbade the creation of images of himself. He knew that human nature tends to worship what can be seen and touched, but true worship in spirit and truth must transcend the physical senses. God desires our connection with him to be evident, based on faith and spiritual understanding, not on objects or images created by human hands. The Bible is a constant reminder that the focus should be on the divine essence and not on trying to capture it through physical means. In modern times, many underestimate the depth of the Bible and seek answers from influencers or self-help books. But it is in the Scriptures that we find true spiritual guidance. Ignoring this divine knowledge is like losing the map to navigate life. The Bible, as the means by which God speaks to us, remains the key to discovering the holiness of life and marriage, the commandments of God, and the principles that can guide our lives in a full and sacred way. And this search for spiritual truth leads to the need to worship with both heart and mind, which we will explore next. True inspiration goes beyond rituals or mere religious traditions. Worshipping in spirit and truth means that both the heart and mind are fully engaged, not relying solely on physical senses. God desires a connection that transcends the visible, that touches our spiritual essence. This is clear when he asks us to love him with all our heart, mind, and strength, the greatest of all the commandments of God. Often, people get caught up in the idea that inspiration only happens in a temple or church. But true worship happens in daily actions as well. When we help someone without expecting anything in return, when we take time to reflect and be thankful for what we have, we are worshiping. This is worship in spirit and truth in practice. A practical example would be setting aside a moment each day, even amid the rush, to read a Bible verse or say a silent prayer as a way to connect with God during your routine. This kind of inspiration also makes us reflect on the impact that faith can have on our daily lives. It helps us see the world through a spiritual lens, where every action has a greater purpose. When we live this way, we realize that inspiration isn't confined to a space or a moment, but is a constant quest to align with God's will. And this quest makes us question why so many turn away from this truth. preferring to follow paths that ignore biblical teachings on holiness. Spiritual ignorance, unfortunately, is becoming increasingly common today. Many trade the deep knowledge of the Holy Scriptures for the words of influencers or self-help authors, who often divert attention from the true spiritual purpose. This happens because there is a growing tendency to seek quick fixes and simple answers to life's challenges, ignoring sacred teachings. However, it is in the Scriptures that we find timeless wisdom, the kind that can truly transform our worldview and our relationship with the sacred. When someone distances themselves from the Bible, they are, in a way, disconnecting from the source of truth. This disconnection creates a spiritual void that cannot be filled by human philosophies or passing trends. Spiritual ignorance often leads to the loss of the sense of the holiness of life and marriage, values essential for a balanced life. The Bible teaches not only about our relationship with God, but also about how to live in harmony with others and with ourselves. Reading the Scriptures regularly, for example, could be the first step to reconnect with these values. It's interesting to note that this spiritual ignorance is also a reflection of modern society, which often values the superficial over the profound. But there is a way out of this spiritual blindness: the return to what is truly sacred. When we place God and His commandments first, our vision changes. We begin to value what really matters and reconsider what we had previously dismissed. This prepares us to understand the weight of the name of Jesus and what it represents for faith, a crucial point in the next topic. The name of Jesus is sacred, carrying unmatched spiritual power. When we mention the name of Jesus, we are referring to what represents the greatest expression of God's love and salvation for humanity. One of the commandments of God makes it clear that using God's name in vain is a violation of this sacredness. However, many fail to perceive the depth of this principle. It's not just about careless words, but about understanding that the name of Jesus carries the power and authority of God Himself and should be treated with reverence. There is something very powerful about invoking the name of Jesus in prayer. When we are going through tough times, when everything seems to be falling apart, saying, "Jesus," is like calling for help directly from the source of all that is sacred. This reminds us that the name of Jesus is not just a word but a spiritual key that opens doors and transforms realities. It's a simple yet powerful practice. When you feel situations are out of control, just invoke the name of Jesus and trust. This connects us directly to God's purpose. But what happens when the name of Jesus is treated with disregard? Unfortunately, the disrespect for the sacred is becoming more and more common. Using the name of Jesus in trivial situations or flippantly reflects the decline of spiritual values in society. This distances us from the understanding of the true sacredness of life and what it means to have Jesus at the center of our faith. And when we lose this reference, we also begin to lose respect for the value of life, a crucial point that we will address in the next topic. Human life is one of God's greatest gifts, carrying with it an undeniable sanctity. From the beginning, God made it clear that life is sacred, and the holiness of life and marriage is one of the fundamental pillars in the Bible. This includes not only our individual lives, but also how we treat the lives of others. In a world where violence and disrespect for life seem to be on the rise, we need to remember the value that God has placed on each human being. Taking a life, whether through murder or even abortion, is seen as a direct violation of this sanctity. But this issue goes beyond what is legal or permitted by society. The sanctity of life is related to how we see and respect God's creation. From the moment of conception to the last breath, human life should be protected and valued. Unfortunately, we often face a society that, instead of protecting, neglects and avenges what is sacred. The violence we see in the news, wars, and the lack of care for the most vulnerable are all reflections of the loss of the sanctity of life. What can we do to reverse this reality? Perhaps one of the simplest and most impactful actions is to treat every person with respect and dignity, recognizing the presence of God in every life. Valuing life also means defending those who cannot defend themselves, such as the unborn, and fighting against injustices that violate the whole. In everyday life. This respect for life should also extend to the institutions that God has designated as sacred, such as marriage, something we will discuss in the next point. Since the dawn of time, marriage has been established as a sacred union by God. It is not just a contract between two people but a spiritual commitment, where both unite under divine blessing to form a new family. The holiness of life and marriage is directly linked to God's purpose for humanity. However, today we see that this sanctity is often ignored or devalued, with many treating marriage as something temporary or unimportant. The altar, once considered a sacred place, is now avoided by many. It's sad to see how the view of marriage has changed. Instead of being seen as an institution of love and eternal commitment, it has become, for some, a mere formality. More and more people are choosing not to marry, preferring informal relationships, without the commitment that marriage requires. This decline in the value of marriage reflects what the Bible warns us about the decline of spiritual values in society. When marriage loses its sacred character, we lose an essential part of the connection to the divine principles that God has left us. However, marriage can still be rescued as a sacred institution if we return to understanding the purpose for which God created it. It is more than a contract. It is a reflection of the unconditional love that God has for us. Honoring marriage is honoring God's will for family life. Those who value this union should fight to restore its sacredness, whether in their own relationships or as an example for others. This loss of respect for the sacred extends to other areas of life, as we will explore by looking at the loss of the sacred in our society. The loss of the sacred is something that has been eroding the foundations of our society. What was once considered untouchable and worthy of reverence is now often treated with indifference or even disdain. This erosion is not limited to life or marriage, but spreads to all aspects of our existence. Objects, places, and rituals that were once marked by God's presence have lost their meaning, contributing to the decline of spiritual values. When we lose the notion of what is sacred, the very essence of our connection with God begins to weaken. This loss is directly reflected in how society treats family, life, and interpersonal relationships. Respect for the sacred is what maintains divine order in things, and when it is despised, spiritual chaos takes its place. Think, for example, of how many today treat places of worship as mere buildings, without considering the holiness they carry. The Bible teaches us the importance of connecting with God through sacred things, and by losing this sensitivity, we distance ourselves from the divine purpose. But this loss of the sacred is not irreversible. There is still time to reclaim the spiritual value of things and bring back the reverence that God asks of us. True transformation begins with valuing what is sacred in our daily lives. Recognizing God's presence in our decisions, relationships, and the simplest things of everyday life can be the first step. And in doing so, we reconnect with the sacred and, consequently, with God, as we prepare to understand the importance of this deep connection in the next point. The sacredness of life's things serves as a direct bridge to our connection with God. It is no coincidence that God designated certain objects, moments, and places as sacred. They exist to remind us of the divine presence and keep us focused on what truly matters, our relationship with the Creator. When we respect the sacred, whether in marriage, life, or the Scriptures, we are directly connecting with God. This is the essence of living a life aligned with the commandments of God and the principles of holiness in everyday life. However, when we lose respect for the sacred, this connection weakens. This can be seen in the spiritual distance that many feel, not realizing that it is precisely the loss of respect for what is holy that draws them away from God. The altar, for example, is a symbol of this connection, where communion between the divine and the human occurs. But when people treat this sacred space as something common, they miss the opportunity to draw closer to the Creator. Respecting the sacred is a way of practicing connecting with God through sacred things, allowing us to strengthen our faith. What can be done to restore this connection? It begins with small gestures. Respecting prayer time, valuing moments when we are in God's presence, whether in a temple or at home. Treating marriage, life, and even moments of silence and reflection as opportunities to draw closer to God. When we do this, we discover that sacredness is not limited to objects or places but permeates all aspects of our existence. And thus, this search for the sacred becomes a continuous journey of faith and devotion. Have you ever stopped to think about what your life would be like if you started applying all this knowledge about the sacred? If you considered God's presence in the small details of your day-to-day life, how could this transform your actions, your relationships, and the way you see the world? The truth is that this connection to the sacred is within your reach, and the choice to reclaim these values is up to you. Are you willing to bring back the sacredness into your life? Let this challenge you to change. Ask yourself, what areas of my life have I treated as common when God asks me to treat them as sacred? Share your reflections here, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. After all, this learning journey is just beginning, and you won't want to miss the next steps to draw even closer to God.